But we're talking to Gad Saad, a behavioral scientist out of Concordia University. Just before we hit the break there, I was getting into social justice warriors and the tactics they use to interrupt these events. Of course, we know they're completely intolerant of diversity of opinion, but they don't go out and picket. They don't wave signs. They pull fire alarms. They make bomb threats. They interrupt events. They smear themselves with blood and scream out. They physically block people from attending these events. Gad Saad, why do they resort to these mob intimidation tactics? It decreases their credibility. What message are they trying to send by doing this?
I think I actually discussed this in a recent Sad Truth clip. I think they have a profoundly erroneous view of what freedom of speech is. They genuinely believe that the tactics that you're speaking of is their exercise of their freedom of speech, right? So they think that stopping you from speaking is a form of free speech, right? They don't recognize that that is a violation of your right to free speech. So it's really it really is a complete inability to understand that freedom of speech means you have a right to speak, and they're allowed to set up an alternate venue where they offer their own dissenting voices. It doesn't mean that they could shut you down, but repeatedly, when I've engaged some of these folks, they truly believe this. And I'll give you another quick example. I've blocked people who were, and on the very rare cases where somebody is, very hostile towards me and insulting and so on, I block them. They usually come back and accuse me of violating their free speech. So how unaware must you be of the most basic tenets of free speech to think that you could follow me around all over Twitter, hurl insults at me on my various social portals, and if I decide to disengage with you, I am violating your freedom to insult me. It's grotesque.
No, I mean, I've had that numerous times. They think that disagreeing with them is you violating their free speech. They have no understanding of debate or dissent whatsoever. And this new thing I've noticed quite recently is we've got these safe spaces now trying to argue that disagreeing with their opinions is a form of violence, actual real violence. We had people walking out of the Milo Yiannopoulos lecture saying they felt physically threatened because he expressed a different opinion. We had the case that you mentioned in your lecture in Ottawa recently, Laura Kipnis. She writes an article suggesting that rape culture might be, fanned by paranoia. She's targeted under the same justification. How can it possibly be argued with any credibility that having a differing opinion is a form of violence?
Well, their position is so fraught with contradictions. So, for example, earlier you were discussing diversity, right? So they're all about racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, sexual orientation diversity. But the most important form of diversity at a university, which is intellectual diversity, that's an absolute no-no. So skin pigmentation diversity, we support that. Diversity of ideas, well, that's just unsafe. We won't tolerate such nonsense. It's grotesque.
Now, I wanted to get into this aspect of it because I sent out a tweet just before I came on the show. See what you make of this. Social media allows arrested development adult babies who never grew up to accumulate power by throwing tantrums. This explains the temptation for lazy, unsuccessful, ugly, and unpopular people to become social justice warriors. You talked about Munchausen syndrome in your lecture. Right. This process where people pretend to be afflicted to garner sympathy. Now they've got the platform of social media to do it. They've organized like never before. They've accumulated this power. Just to explain how that relates to the growth, the connection between social media and this expression of this Munchausen syndrome.
So as you said, Munchausen syndrome is this psychiatric disorder where people get ego strokes. They get attention by feigning illness, by feigning injury. Well, imagine if now I could be given a massive platform where I incessantly cry victimhood. I'm going to get attention and it becomes orgasmic.
But right now we're talking to Gad Saad, and sorry I had to cut you off before the break. We've got a long segment here so we can really get into it. Now, I just raised the point of, people are always asking me where this sudden obsession with, oppression Olympics, grievance culture, safe space, where did it come from? Well, as John Ronson talks about in his book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, he makes the point that, like never before, organized groups of citizens have had this much power. They have access to this newfound power. It's very alluring because social justice warriors are, by and large, lazy, unsuccessful people. They've suddenly got access to this huge platform, which allows them to project themselves out onto the world, to blame the world for their own inadequacies. You combine that, Gad Saad, with Munchausen syndrome, and it's a toxic combination, isn't it?
It's orgiastic, right? I mean, it's a wonderful venue. Look, if I happen to be overweight, right now, I could look at this as an opportunity to lose weight when my physician says, "Hey, it's healthy for you to be thinner," or I could take the social justice warrior approach and say, "Look, you're engaging in fatism, doctor. You're not accepting me for being differently weighted, and that's inappropriate because you have to love me for how I am," right? So it's really a question of how comfortable you are with yourself, how secure you are with who you are, and that allows you to then navigate the realities of life, right? But victimhood gives somebody a card, a get out of jail card for all of their failures, right? I mean, it's easier for me to say that Hollywood images are perpetuating images of a thin guy ideal, and hopefully then I can argue that that's not fair. They should love me for who I am, and my physician is a fattest, than to actually have to go through the hard work of losing weight, right? And so this is really a symptom of the more general ethos of victimology, right?
Well, exactly. It's them making excuses for their bad lifestyle choices,
right,
for the fact that they are unsuccessful, that they don't work hard enough, because we do live in a meritocracy, by and large. It's not perfect, but that's the society that we live in. And rather than actually go through the process of working hard, working their way up intellectually, they'd rather just blame their problems on the rest of the world and claim that that's the reason why they are, and then build a platform off of that by using social media, which again allows them to accumulate more and more power. But I also wanted to get your take on the Trump phenomenon, because this ties into political correctness, of course. This is a debate that's been going back and forth. Do you think that support for Trump represents a genuine, organic backlash against political correctness, or is it simply a consequence of him filling the vacuum created by those public intellectuals that were too cowardly to stand up for true liberal principles?
I think it's a bit of both, right? So, for example, if we take the issue of Muslim immigration, right? Somewhere between his blanket statement, ban all Muslims, and the position taken by, say, someone like Paul Stockton, the former Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense, or Eric Holder, there are these great exchanges in Congress where they're simply unwilling to utter the word Islamic-based terrorism, right? So somewhere between being a complete member of the ostrich brigade and having a blanket statement such as Donald Trump's is the happy medium. And I think people are responding to the fact that they're fed up of seeing how the public discourse is so false, right? I mean, the narrative is not difficult to see. It's as clear as the existence of gravity, yet we have to consistently be told that, don't believe your lying eyes. And so he, I guess, exudes or exhibits or signals a measure of authenticity, rightly or wrongly so. That's, I think, what the people are responding to. He's viewed as an outsider in the political sphere who just shoots from the hips and just says what's on his mind. And I think people are responding to that.
And I read some quotes out earlier in the show, one from a 50-year-old leftist liberal college professor out of California, who said that he was voting for Donald Trump simply to see the look on social justice warriors' faces if Donald Trump won. So again, that goes back right to the liberal professor who was terrified of his own students. We do actually still have classical liberals who believe in truly liberal principles, but are afraid to say it in public, yet they'll go and vote for somebody like Trump.
Oh, and I see it all the time on my private personal Facebook page, right? The aping of the same position, especially amongst my academic friends, is simply astonishing, right? I mean, you'd think that, sure, they're more likely to be partisan of one end of the political spectrum. I understand that. But the fact that otherwise sophisticated, intelligent intellectuals can't exhibit any heterogeneity when it comes to these fundamental political issues suggests that there is a real sort of signaling going on. And the signal in this case is, if you in any way like anything that Donald Trump says, you must be a toothless redneck guy from Arkansas. And of course they're not, and therefore they disassociate themselves from him.
No, it's increasingly a bigger misnomer that those are Trump supporters. Again, I read out a quote from a 20-year-old gay Arab Muslim student who's voting for Trump for his own reasons. So it's more of a cross-section than, they'd like us to believe. But getting back to, professors and intellectual cowardice, you talk about this in your lecture in Ottawa. To what extent are public intellectuals and professors themselves responsible for the evisceration of free speech and this chilling climate when they submit to fear over political correctness, when they refuse, as you give the example, to even like your status on Facebook, even if they agree with it?
Well, of course, what you just said is exactly true. But more generally, the fact that there isn't diversity of thought on campuses. I mean, I discussed in the lecture in question a study, not done by me, but by some colleagues, where they looked at political affiliation of professors. And the numbers were simply astonishing, right? I mean, across disciplines, it was something like 5-1 toward the Democrats. But in certain fields, especially the social justice warrior-laden fields, humanities and sociology and women's studies and so on, it could go up as high as 44-1. I mean, that's not good, right? I mean, there are certain things that are scientific facts that we can all agree on, but when it comes to fiscal policy or foreign policy or affirmative action or whether the death penalty is good or not, it is welcome to have a diversity of positions. And yet when you create an echo chamber called the university, where one group of folks are almost never represented, that's not good for a free society.
Now, I want to move on to one of the expressions of, social justice warriors in terms of this idea that everything is a social construct. This is what's come to dominate the cultural narrative now for many years. Of course, a lot of it is based on French postmodernism, which you made a very funny video about a couple of days ago, which is complete mumbo jumbo, has zero meaning whatsoever. And like you, I went through the process of trying to read some of these, French postmodernists, Foucault, Albert Camus, etc., thinking, am I just too dumb to get this? I mean, does it actually mean anything? No, it means absolutely nothing. It's mumbo jumbo. But a lot of that, gender is a social construct. There's no real meaning in anything. That arose out of the French postmodernists. You gave a TED talk in which you explained that, in fact, gender preferences are innate and biological, which, of course, completely contradicts this gender as a social construct idea. Just walk us through that research that you outlined in the TED talk.
Right. So, my main area of research is to apply evolutionary psychology and biology in general to study consumer behavior. And so you can't engage in that enterprise without recognizing that there are innate sex differences that define human beings. As a matter of fact, the manner in which Homo sapiens are defined is, by definition, a sexually dimorphic species, meaning that there are innate actual differences between the sexes. That's how biologists define our species. Now, the social constructivists started off with the idea that we are born tabula rasa, with empty brains, empty slates. And what then makes us who we are is that we transcend our biology. It's all due to socialization. We learn to love tall guys from Hollywood images. Guys learn to love shapely women because they watch Penthouse. Everything is due to a social construction, and that's laughable. And so what I do in my TED Talk, but more generally in all of my research, is I dismantle this idea that there is nothing that is biologically based. So even if you take something like toy preferences, there are unbelievably compelling evidence that demonstrate that there are innate differences between boys and girls when it comes to toy preferences. Would you like me to go through some of these?
Yeah, go for it.
So, for example, if you take little children who are too young to be socialized, right? So by definition, they could not have learned these preferences. They will stare at or or go toward sex-specific toys, right? So by definition, they couldn't have learned these. If you take other species like vervet or rhesus monkeys, their infants exhibit the same sex-specific toy preferences that occurs with human infants. If you take a disorder known as congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is an endocrinological disorder, if a little girl suffers from it, she becomes masculinized in her behaviors and in her morphology, while a girl who suffers from that disorder will then exhibit boy-like behaviors. You could look at Sweden, which is a country that has sought to eradicate any gender markers, right? They've been engaged in this huge social experiment for the past 40 years to remove gender. Well, if you do a study of toy preferences there, the exact same sex-specific toy preferences occur. So there's an endless number of studies spanning very, very different disciplines that show that there are innate differences between the sexes. Now, the reason why feminists and others don't like this idea is because they wrongly think that to argue that there are sex differences means that the sexist status quo will continue.
With Gad Saad, and just before we hit the break there, we were talking about this idea of gender as a social construct, which of course is completely demolished by the actual science. We had this article out of the Daily Mail. Sorry, Mom, I'm straight. Oversharing mother who blogs about her pride in her rainbow boy reveals how her son finally plucked up the courage to come out to her as heterosexual. So now we've got parents believing in this postmodernist idea that everything is relative, that everything is a social construct. And Gad Saad, if they really take that on board, given that it's completely unscientific and antagonistic towards basic biological truths, that's really going to cause some problems with these children growing up, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, look, as a scientist, all I care about, all I'm committed to is the honest pursuit of the truth, right? We all try our best to get as close to the truth as we can via the various scientific enterprises that we engage in. And what upsets me is when you have the social sciences and the humanities building theoretical and so-called empirical edifices over the past 100 years that are really built on absolute nonsense. So just to move from sex differences to another type of difference, the idea, for example, of cultural relativism, right, that all cultures are unique and distinct and equal, started with Franz Boas, a cultural anthropologist, who recognized that sometimes biology could be misused for nefarious reasons. And therefore, let's create a new worldview, a bullshit worldview, but nonetheless a worldview where biology ceases to matter. There are no such things, in his view, such things as human nature or human universals. Everything is constrained by the unique culture that you come in. Now, that is such a laughably false position that you genuinely wonder how otherwise intelligent, sophisticated academics could espouse such things. Well, they espouse them because their ideology trumps the pursuit of truth. And that's why we should never allow ideology to infiltrate the scientific enterprise.
And it causes real damage, this idea that all cultures are equal and should all be tolerated equally. I mean, in India, every year UNICEF has to do a massive public relations campaign where they say, please don't crap in the street. It's causing horrible diseases in children.
Right.
600 million people in India still crap on the street because it's part of their culture. If you say, well, that's a bad culture, it needs to be changed, they need to be educated out of that kind of behavior because it's dangerous, then, you know, you're racist. So that's a concrete example of how not all cultures are equal, correct?
Exactly. And it's precisely this ideological bent that is, if you like, placing handcuffs on people when trying to discuss things like immigration from countries that might otherwise not share the values of our Western liberal traditions, right? I mean, it doesn't make you a racist to say that if you come from a particular region of the world, you're likely to be less tolerant of Jews or of gays or of women or of animals or of non-believers. That is an absolute fact that is as clear as the existence of gravity. Now, does that mean that every single person who comes from those lands is likely to exhibit that type of intolerance? Of course not. But on the aggregate, does it mean that if you are from Sweden, you're more likely to be tolerant tolerant of homosexuality than if you're from Yemen? Absolutely yes. And we have to be able to feel sufficiently self-confident to otherwise enunciate these banally trivial realities, right? But most people are afraid to do so, lest they might be accused of being a racist, a bigot, an Islamophobe, and so on.
And that's the thing. I mean, the West is the most tolerant place in the world, and yet we're constantly castigated as being the most racist. If you go to some of these areas in the Middle East and try to be homosexual, try to live your own independent alternative lifestyle, in many cases they will behead you, but blame is always placed on the West.
Well,
in the final minute,
yeah,
Gad Saad, just give out final comments and tell people where they can find your Twitter and YouTube channel.
So at Gad, G-A-D-S-A-A-D, and you could find my YouTube channel by just entering my name, Gad Saad. I have a series of clips called The Sad Truth. I hope you'll subscribe and enjoy the reason.
Okay, Gad Saad, thanks for joining us.
Cheers. Thank you so much for having me again.